All right, this is December 6th, 2025. This is Brennan Ames interviewing Oliver Wakeman. Oliver, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you very much. And you good yourself?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
First, I'd like to talk about the upcoming tour of mainly the East Coast that you have with your dad, Rick Wakeman. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'm quite looking forward to it actually. I think it's about 12, 13 shows, like you said, across the East Coast. And it's what's really going to be interesting about it is that Dad and I haven't really played much together over the years. Everybody seems to think that because, I'm his son, that we spent all our lives growing up and him teaching us the piano, my brother as well. And I spent my childhood learning yes pieces, which is absolutely not true at all. Dad and I have only ever played together probably 5 times, and I'm in my 50s now, so not very many times at all. And then he just wrote to me about 2 or 3 months ago and just said, would I like to do a tour with him? He was going to do something with I think it was a singer called Haley, and she couldn't make it. And he was trying to think of what else he could do that was a bit different. And we played a concert together at the beginning of the year. We did a charity concert to raise money for a school for children with special needs. And and we played together there. And I think he thought, oh, that was good fun. Maybe he'd like to do it again. So yeah, so he asked me whether I would do it. And I thought, yeah, I'd love to. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's been a while since I've been over to America. I mean, last time I was over was probably with Yes, a
Oh,
good
wow.
12 years ago. Yeah, I haven't been played a bit round here, around Europe and stuff, but not been back to America since. Yeah, so really looking forward to that. And I've sort of been looking at the dates, trying to see if there was anywhere that I recognise, but I'm really not sure. I'll find out when I'm there. I'll go, oh yeah, hang on, this looks familiar.
Sorry. So you just said that, you didn't grow up learning yes pieces a lot. You didn't grow up listening to your dad all the time. What was your introduction to yes music?
Yeah, well, my mum and dad split up and divorced when I was about 5. So my dad had sort of left home by the time I was sort of 5, 6, which was about 1977, 1978 time. Um, and I didn't really know anything about what Dad did at that sort of age. And it was only when I got into I suppose it was my early teens. My mum was having a clear out of some stuff from from the loft, and she brought down a collection of records for me and said, "Oh, do you want these?" And she brought down "Going for the One" and "Tales from Topographic Oceans." Um, so they were the first two that I really heard. And obviously, I really liked Going for the One because it's a little bit more accessible than Tales. But I did enjoy Tales from Topographic Oceans, always particularly like the intro, the opening part of it. I thought the artwork was amazing, and I sort of started to really sort of understand what Dad was doing. Um, so those were the first two that I really heard. And I think it was probably my dad lived in Switzerland, and then he got divorced in Switzerland, and then came back over to live in the UK. And I was probably around 13, so I knew a lot of Dad's solo stuff,
Hmm.
but I didn't really know the Yes stuff. And I remember he had a house with 3 floors to it, and on the top floor he had a snooker table, and he put a stereo up there with a load of records. And I went up there and used to go and play snooker. And I remember going up there, and one of the records was Tomato. And I started playing Tomato all the time whilst I was just practicing playing snooker. And I just loved that record. I mean, that's still to this day, except for the stuff that I've done with Yes, that's still my sort of non-me favorite Yes music. I still really like it. And I think it's because I was, oh, how old would I have been? About 15.
Yeah.
And I think it was just the songs were complex enough to be really interesting, but short enough to be a bit impactful. And I think it sort of probably hit me at the right time, that album. So they were my sort of introductions to it. And then I sort of became a bit of a fan of the music anyway and
Hmm.
started picking up the other stuff, the Fragiles, the Close to the Edges, all the other bits and pieces. Um, but yeah, so they were probably the three that I got introduced to.
Hmm. What was your introduction to learning musical instruments like keyboards?
I was I can remember it. My memory is terrible, but I can remember. Um, I can't remember how old I was. I was probably about 4, and we had a lounge, and in the lounge was a grand piano. And I remember walking into the lounge and walking up to the grand piano, and I got my fingers, and I just opened the lid, and I put my hands on the keys, and somehow, by complete chance, I hit a chord. I must have hit a first, third, and a fifth or something, and it sounded nice. And I went, "Wow, that's amazing." And thought, "Brilliant. Okay, well, that's good. I like this." And then tried again, and it sounded dreadful. Um, and so I said I wanted to go to lessons, and I remember being 4 or 5 and going to lessons during the break time. So all my friends were outside running around, screaming, having fun, and I was in a room with somebody putting the stars on your fingers and the stars on the keys. And I can distinctly remember that to this day. And I remember sort of really enjoying that. And I did piano lessons, for quite a long time. Then I started to learn how to play guitar, and then I started playing in bands. But yeah, so it goes back a really, to a really young age.
What was some of the music that you were influenced by when you were younger?
Uh, Probably a lot of bands that you probably don't know over in your side of the pond, but there was lots of sort of typical 80s bands when I was growing up because I was a child of I was born in the 70s, but my teenage years were across the 80s. So I
Yeah.
became a teenager in about 84, 85. So that was a period of time. But what I do remember is I discovered at about the age of about 13, we went on a holiday. And the one band I did like from a young age was Pink Floyd, the very early Pink Floyd stuff. So
Yeah.
I used to have an early copy of Relics and Saucer Full of Secrets, and I loved those records. Can't even remember how I got hold of them, but I loved those records. And then one day I was in a shop on holiday, and they had a little basket full of cassettes for sale. And I picked up a cassette of Deep Purple.
Oh,
Well, you may know Deep Purple, good old fashioned blues rock and roll band.
yeah.
And I said to my mum, "Are they anything like Pink Floyd?" And she just, I think, just went yes, because she doesn't really know. And I put it on in the car, and I loved it. And I just listened to Deep Purple all the time. And from that, I sort of thought, "Wow, this is great." And because all my friends were into 80s music, we used to go to record stores all the time and go and buy records. And I suddenly started to decide to be a bit different. So I sort of thought, well, I like Deep Purple, and everybody else is buying records by Duran Duran or Aha. And so I would start buying other Deep Purple records, and they would sort of say to me, "What's that? What are you buying that for?" And it's like, "Well, this is really cool." And then from that, I discovered other bands that I liked listening to. And the next one I picked up, I remember picking up 2112 by Rush
Yeah.
purely because it had them dressed on the back slightly effeminate. And I thought, this will wind up my friends. So I remember buying that one, and I took it home and put it on the record player. And I thought, wow. And it just sort of blew me away, that record. And then, of course, I got Hemispheres. Uh, and that was just as amazing. I can't remember if it's Hemispheres first or 2112 first, but whatever it was, those two albums became massive when I was growing up. Just
Mhm.
absolutely loved them. And so yeah, so Rush was a huge, huge band for me. So was Deep Purple, and then of course I started getting more of the Pink Floyd stuff, and then sort of started listening to things, Fleetwood Mac. Went through all that sort of stuff, and I remember because my mum and dad divorced. I had a stepdad, and and he used to say to me, "Blimey, you're listening to all the stuff that I was listening to 10 years ago." And I would just do this all the time. I'd go to secondhand record shops and buy loads of things and just sit there and just absorb different bands, different music. So
Yeah.
that's really what. And the one band that I really did love was Styx, which was
Yeah.
not well known in the UK, but that was one of the records that my mum brought down from the attic for me that time, because I think it was from A&M, and it was the same record that Dad's solo records were on.
Yeah.
And so I think he had a copy of that, and they gave me that record, and I loved Styx, and I still loved listening to Styx to this day.
What were some of the early bands you were in? Was it people that you knew from school, or like how did you get connected with them?
My own bands,
Yeah.
yeah, my own bands were probably, yeah, like a lot of people. It was a bunch of kids from school listening to it. Probably it wasn't even bands that we all liked the same thing. They were just
Hmm.
people that had instruments that, were different to the instrument you played. So I had a
Yeah.
couple of guys, one of them had a drum kit and the other one had a bass guitar, and I had a keyboard. And I think we used to play in his garage and just write songs that were dreadful. And that was quite good fun. And then, when nobody was around, I used to get on the drums and sort of learn to play the drums a bit and learn to play all these other instruments. So that was probably my first sort of bands. And then I ended up doing a few things with a couple of, close friends where we just sort of wrote a few musical ideas. But then what really happened for me was probably about 16, 17. I lived in a little village down near the coast, down in Devon, which is down on the west coast of England. And it was a sort of holiday destination. And there were loads and loads of pubs and clubs. And I started to go to these clubs on sort of, I suppose what you call them now, sort of open mic nights, but where you
Mhm.
would sort of get up and play with the house band and you get up and play. And so I used to sort of carry a keyboard down to these pubs and wait my turn and get up and play. And everybody in the band was always older than me. I was like 16, 17, sneaking into the pub. And all these people were in their 40s and 50s. And I would just get up and play along with them. And probably wasn't very good, but just really enjoyed getting up there and learning how to play in front of people and learning all those tricks that you have to do when you're on stage with somebody that you don't know and you don't know a piece of music. You get up and they'll say, well, what are we playing? And they'd say, oh, it's so and so, and and you wouldn't know the chord structure or anything. So because I learned how to play guitar and I learned how to play bass guitar, I could sort of get up on stage and I could watch people's fingers and I could work out what key they were in and where they were going. And
Yeah.
you'd sort of slowly work your way through. You'd go, okay, so we're A for a while here. Yeah, okay, he's F sharp now for a bit. Let's okay, all right. And then you'd sort of go it, and then as the song would go on, you would elaborate the part and build up. And that was it was a really useful way of learning. And then from that, I joined um, sort of any band I could really. I've joined function bands where we'd go out and play weddings and parties. I joined blues bands, blues rock bands, big bands that sort of did long improvisational sessions,
Mm.
sort of jam bands and structured bands where you had to play exactly to the note. Some of the function bands were like that. And I loved all that until I got to a point where my wife said to me, because I'd done a few records and I was still playing with all these bands. And my wife said to me, she said, I think it's time you put your own band together. You've got records out. You've got records out and people like the music you do. It's probably about time you put your own band together and actually went out and started playing your own music rather than just playing with all these other bands all the time. And that was a bit of a leap to suddenly stop playing with, bands that you could earn money with, where people would come along to try and do something different. But it was, yeah, that was really exciting. So it was a sort of a bit of a journey through anything. My dad said that my granddad used to say to him, play everywhere and anywhere, play as often as you can with as many
Mhm.
different people because you'll learn more. And so I did that, and I enjoyed playing with lots of people that were older than me because they had a lot more experience and they knew a lot more,
Mhm.
and that was really useful. And that carried on through pretty much all the bands I played with, like Yes and Strawbs. They were all older than me.
Yeah.
Um, so I just carried that on all through my life. It's only now with my own band that I realize I'm the oldest. Everybody's younger than me now. It's
Yeah.
gone the other way.
When did you first get involved with Yes? I know you made some albums with Steve before, but tell me about that.
The records with Steve were, I mean, I got to know Steve Howe in the 80s. And
Mm.
like I said at the beginning of the interview, everybody sort of imagine that when I was growing up, Chris, Steve, Alan, Bill Brifford, or whatever, were all around the house drinking cups of tea, and I'd sit in a room whilst they'd all practice. But it wasn't really like that at all. Dad was away on tour all the time, and him and my mum had split up by the time I was 5. So it didn't really happen like that. But when they did the Anderson, Brifford, Wakeman, and Howe tour, which was about 89, um, I went over to America with my brother to go and watch some of the shows. And when we were over there, Tony Levin was on bass in that band, and Tony
Mhm.
Levin got sick. So after about 2 shows, the band stopped and had to sort of postpone a few shows. And so what happened was is that in that meantime, they went into the studio to record an alternative version of a track called I'm Alive. And I spent a lot of time in the studio with Steve Howe, just got chatting, talking about stuff. I'd sit in the studio while he was recording his guitar parts. And I was only 16, 17. And I just got quite friendly with him and got chatting with him. And then, of course, the tour finished and I went back to school and dad stopped working with Yes again. It all disappeared. And then, oddly enough, I was at a train station and I bumped into Steve Howe about a couple of years later. And we got chatting and he said, oh, we didn't live too far from each other. He said, oh, you must come over at some point. So I went over and we got chatting and he we talked about music and that's when he sort of said, oh, it'd be nice to work together on something. And I was writing a record called Three Ages of Magic, which he played guitar on. And then he asked me to play on one of his records. And so we just sort of had a friendship like that, which is involved around music. But I'd often just drive over to his house and we'd sit and talk about music and what was going on. Um, and I think, that's sort of how my involvement really came back into joining Yes, really, was probably through Steve. Because we'd already worked together. He already knew what I was, what my music playing was like, the style of piano that I played, and he obviously thought that it would be a good fit. And I think, when Dad didn't want to do Yes anymore, I think he'd obviously said, I think he said, oh, well, either of my boys could probably do that. And I think because I'd worked with Steve, I got the nod. So it was yeah, a bit of a journey, but it's nice to get there.
And what was your reaction when you got the call to join Yes?
I remember my wife and I were out and we got in and we had an arts machine and we got in and pressed play and the message was from Steve Howe saying, Oliver, can you give me a call, please? And so I called him up and he said, we'd like you to come and join the band. Your dad's not doing the tour. And this was when John Anderson was in the band.
Hmm.
And I was like, oh wow. So I went and sort of spoke to my wife because it meant leaving home for a while, going out
Yeah.
on tour. And she was very supportive, but it was a difficult time because I just had a young son, so my son was only a couple of years old, which made it a bit difficult being away from home from such a young lad. Um, but then John got ill, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. And I thought, oh well, technically I've been in Yes, even though I've never played a note. I've
Yeah.
been asked, I've been accepted. And then I got a call from Steve Howe about 2 or 3 months later saying that they wanted to still go out on tour. John wasn't going to be able to do the tour because he was still unwell, and that they'd found this Canadian singer, Benoit David. And was I still interested? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And so that's really what happened. And then I think they sent me the set about 3 weeks before the first show, and I just spent 3 weeks absolutely cramming as much music as I could into my head for a 3.5 hour show.
What was it like learning the different keyboard parts, the parts of Tony Kaye, Rick Wakeman, and Jeff Downes?
I mean, it was great. It's always great to play different keyboard players' parts because you learn and you understand how they approach things. What what was difficult about that time, and which I think is the thing that is probably a little bit harder to understand now, is that in those days, oh, it makes me sound really old, but it's about 2008. It's probably about 17 years ago was when I first joined. You didn't have all these files on YouTube where everything had been separated and you could hear all the keyboard parts and you could slow things down and you could work stuff out that way. You didn't have all these bits and tutorials and things. So back then it was a case of putting on a CD and sort of listening to it and going, what did he play? And then going back and playing it again and trying to work it out and write things down. So it was a bit like that, trying to sort of create a jigsaw puzzle backwards, trying
Hmm.
to understand what all these parts were. And then the thing that we talked about was obviously I can improvise and make stuff up on the
Yeah.
spot. But I sort of felt when I was with Yes and joining Yes that it didn't make sense for me to be doing that to Yes music because even though Dad could take the And You and I solo and do it completely differently because he wrote the original. He can do that. I didn't think that was right. The only places that I felt I could probably have a bit of leeway was probably towards the end of the show, Roundabout and Starship Trooper, where you could be a little bit more yourself. So I thought, well, what I'll try and do to bring to the band is go back to a sort of authentic sound, try and find, the sounds that match what were on the original records and play the parts that were on the original records. Um, and so I sort of spent a lot of time learning that. But what made it slightly more complicated was that Yes have over the years had rearranged the music. So Roundabout Live, as I know you've seen Yes a few times, Roundabout Live is different to Roundabout on the Fragile record.
Hmm.
There's different arrangements to it. So when I was learning the music, I couldn't practice. It was difficult to play along to the live versions because they were playing, Dad would make up his own keyboard stuff. So I was sort of having to learn it twice. I was having to learn it to the original record and then pick up this original record and then rearrange it to work with the live version, but using the original record parts rather than the parts that Dad was playing at the time.
Hmm.
So it did get a little bit complicated. Um, and When I got over to America, I had a brand new keyboard rig to learn at the same time. So it was a very stressful couple of weeks when I first arrived in Canada to learn all the material. But over time, all these things sort of slotted. Every day got a little bit easier. Every day, something else slotted into place. And I think the hardest thing with the Yes stuff was it wasn't so much the different types of keyboard playing parts. It was just the pure volume of music you were trying to remember and learn in such a short period of time. And of course, as well, it was the early days of Pro Tools. It was the early days of um, MIDI controllers and all this sort of stuff. So everything was manual. I had a keyboard rig of 8 keyboards, and then I had charts to make sure I changed sounds at certain points. So there was an awful lot of choreography as well that sort of had to be developed,
Yeah.
to try and get yourself through the show. So it was an awful lot of thinking, and the shows used to go like that. They were so fast because you were just thinking the whole time. And after 4 or 5 shows, it becomes a little bit more natural. You sort of slowly, move into it just becoming, what you do. It was good fun. It was great fun. And, playing, I mean, I got to play some Patrick Moraz's parts, Jeff's
Hmm.
parts, Dad's parts, Tony's parts. Um, yeah, it was good fun.
Did it feel weird going out replacing your dad in Yes at all?
Um, Not really, actually. And it's a bit odd at first because obviously everybody would come up to you and talk to you about your dad. So that was a bit unusual. But I mean, Chris Stephen Allen, it sort of didn't really become a thing, I think, after a while. Because, I mean, Chris used to say to me sometimes, he'd say, it's a bit weird. He said, sometimes I'll be playing and I'll look across and it'll be like looking at your dad because my dad and I are quite similar in the way that we talk and the way that we look.
Mhm.
And Chris used to say, sometimes he'd look across the stage and it'd be like, wow, it feels like it's 30 years ago. Um, but then there were other times where we'd be in the van and I'd be talking to Chris, and Chris would say to me, he said, he said, like 50% of the time, he said, you're identical to your dad. And he said, the other 50% of the time, you're nothing like your dad, which was quite nice because it meant, they were realizing that I was my own person. And because I'd worked with Steve as well, it wasn't uncomfortable. Steve knew me for me. He wasn't just going, "Oh, that's Rick's son." He knew me as Oliver, and so that was easy. It made it easier. So yeah, it didn't really become a thing. It was probably more with the fans more than anything else. People wanted to talk to me about Dad, and that's fine. I get it. People are interested in him. He's fantastic. So why wouldn't people want to talk to me about him? I was quite happy to talk to people about him.
And then for the Fly From Here album, which was 2009, which was when you were replaced by Jeff Downes, what was happening at that time?
I think really that whole situation was, I mean, it was uncomfortable. It wasn't, it
Hmm.
wasn't the best time in my life. But I think really what it boiled down to is Trevor Horn wanted to do the album his way. Because it started off with Trevor just being involved in one song. Um, and then Trevor wanted to do more of his songs, and then he wanted to do more of his songs. And suddenly the album became more about Trevor than it did about the music that we'd written. And because he was doing all that stuff, he wanted to work with Jeff. And I think that's what it boiled down to. He just wanted to work with Jeff because he'd written the songs with Jeff. And he was, I think he'd made up his mind pretty much before he'd even come over to see us the first time, was that he wanted to work with Jeff. And I think that was it, really. There wasn't really much I could do about that. So it
Mhm.
it just happened, which was a shame. But you know, later people got to hear the music that I would have worked on with the band, or that I worked on with the band, and people got an idea of the direction that we actually were going as a band.
Yeah. What was your reaction when you got the call to join the Strawbs, which of course your dad was also in?
Yeah, that was good. That was a bit weird actually, because yeah, it was a bit odd being in both bands at the same time. They phoned me up. I think I'd already joined Yes, and they phoned me up and said, "Would you join the Strawbs?" And I said, "Well, I can, but I'm going to be out on tour with Yes." And they said, "Well, how about if we structure our tours so our tours work in between the Yes tours? Would you be able to do it then?" And I chat with my wife, and she was okay with it. And so I said, "Yeah, fine. I'd love to do it." And so I did, did quite a few tours with the Strawbs. It was really good fun. Again, that was a bit unusual because obviously Dad had worked with Dave Cousins for many years, who passed away earlier this year. Um, and then obviously there was none of the other guys in the band were in the band when Dad was in the band, but the bass player was Chaz Cronk, who was also my godfather from when I was a little boy, and he played in Dad's band in the 80s. So yeah, so it was a bit unusual to again be in a world that was, very related to Dad's world. But I think with the Strawbs, I mean, they've always had good keyboard players, but I think they wanted a keyboard player that could come into the band and perform some of the stuff that Dad had done from the early 70s, the albums like From the Witchwood and A Collection of Antiques and Curious, and have a bit more of that, maybe sort of a bit more flair playing. Whereas some of the keyboard players had been a bit they'd had strengths in different areas, and so
Mhm.
I think me joining the band gave them the opportunity to play some music that they hadn't played for a long time. So that was really good fun. I really enjoyed those tours. And it was a bit odd actually because we played the very first Yes tour was in Hamilton in Canada, and my first tour abroad with the Strawbs, I I think was also one of the ones in Canada, and we did actually go and play in Hamilton as well. So it was
Wow.
very strange to go back to Hamilton. I mean, we lived in Hamilton for a while we were rehearsing before we did the first Yes show. And then I've said goodbye to all the staff there when we moved away, went on the tour. And then, 6 months later, I'm back walking through the door saying hello again with a different band. It was quite good fun.
Mhm. What contact did you have with the members of Yes after you left?
Uh, I didn't for a while, understandably. Um, but Chris and I used to keep in touch. We used to get we used to email each other every now and then. He wrote to me afterwards. Um, Very nice email, actually. He wrote to me afterwards and said he was sorry that it had turned out the way that it had turned out because it wasn't what they wanted. It was because of what um, Trevor wanted for the record, and he was very apologetic because after all that happened, I did actually go out on one more tour with them, which was a bit unusual because obviously I knew I wasn't going to be carrying on. They knew I wasn't going to be carrying on, and Chris was very very apologetic. And he said, I didn't want it to happen. He said, I would rather we carried on the way we were carrying on. And Steve had said a similar thing to me. So I think it was one of those situations in life where, the management wanted to do a certain thing, the producer wanted to do a certain thing. Trevor has a track record. And I think it was just thought, this is probably the direction to go. But for me, I sort of felt we were pretty good as a live band. We'd written some pretty good music, and it would have been nice to have done the record the way we wanted to do the record.
And obviously, have released a record. Yes has released a record with you after your time, which I think you have sitting over on your keyboard. What was that like to compile?
From a page. Well, that was what happened was when I left the band. They said to me that on Fly From Here they wouldn't be using any of the music that I'd written, um, which Trevor had actually really liked the music that I'd written. But then they sent me. I said, well, I'm doing a solo record. Could I have copies of the tapes of what we'd recorded together? And so they sent me these DVDs full of all the Pro Tools sessions, and they just sat on sat on my shelf. And I thought about arranging them for a record I was doing, which I didn't do in the end. And I remember I can't remember exactly what year it was. It was probably about 2013, something like that. And I can't remember exactly what year it was that Chris died, but I was
2015.
2015. Yeah, so it's about 20. Yeah, you're right, 2015, because I was moving house. That's right. And I was packing up my music room to go to move to the new house, and I hadn't listened to Yes music in a good few years. And I had a copy. In fact, I had this record here, the Live from Leon
Mhm.
vinyl. And I thought, do you know what? I've never listened to it, even though I worked on the mix on
Wow.
it and put all the work on it. And I thought, I've never listened to it since it's come out. So I put it on, and I was listening to it thinking, gosh, this is all right, actually. We did quite a good job here. And then I went downstairs, and my laptop was on the kitchen table or the dining room table. And I just looked at it, and I had a message from Paul Silvera, who was the tour manager. And he told me that Chris had just passed away. And I had the record Live from Leon going upstairs, and it was like, wow, Chris has passed away. And I can hear Chris upstairs playing. It was a bit of an unusual moment. And so when I moved into the new house, once we sort of got it up and running, I remember thinking, I'm gonna have a listen to those discs of what we recorded. And the first one that I sort of went through, The Gift of Love, and I spent quite a lot of time pulling all that, because effectively it was just us playing through it a few times, different parts, different playlist versions, and all these different parts and all these different vocal bits going off and on. And it was took quite a while to pull it all together and pull it into the shape of the track that it was. Um, and I thought, I'm going to do that. I'm going to pull it together just for me, just so I've got a version of the songs that we did. I didn't do the other two or three tracks that we did, but that one I just sort of spent some time working on, and for about a year or two, probably 2 years or so, it just sat on my shelf as almost like a hidden Yes song that nobody knew about. And I was sort of quite, I quite enjoyed that. I quite enjoyed the fact that I had this piece of Yes music that no one else had ever heard. Um, and then I was sort of playing it one day, and I think I do quite a bit on social media, and I just tweeted, so just listening to a Yes piece of music that no one's ever heard before from Martin. And that's when the Yes management got in touch with me and said, can we have a chat? And so we had a chat about it, and the whole thing sort of snowballed from there. I went back and remixed all the other tracks, pulled it all together, and then Steve and I got together and played him the songs, and he sat there and said, these are great. These are really, really good. Absolutely, we've got to put these out. And so I sort of went back and carried on working on all the tracks, got all the mixes together, ran them past Steve and the management. And then it was like, well, actually, let's put this out as a Yes record. Let's do it. Let's just make it a Yes record. And I think it sort of surprised everybody. It sold out really quickly. They repressed it. It sold out again. They did a vinyl. It sold out. They did a different colored vinyl that sold out. So it suddenly, I think it got a lot more of a response than they thought it was going to get, which was lovely. And the reports that everybody um, gave me and the reviews everybody gave were lovely. Everybody seemed to really like hearing the direction that the band was going to go into, if it hadn't followed the Trevor route.
Mhm. You just released a solo album last year. What was it like working on that?
Oh, well, that was great. That was a record called Anam Cara, which is a Gaelic word, for translated means soul friend. And I'd always wanted to, well, in fact, I say I always wanted to do the record I mentioned earlier, which was the Three Ages of Magic record, which was with Steve Howe played on it. On that record, I'd experimented with some whistles and flutes and Ilian pipes, and I just loved the sound that those instruments make. And I'd always been wanting to get back to doing another record with those instruments on. I had a wonderful vocalist called Hayley Griffiths, who's coming out on the tour with me later on next year,
Hmm.
and she sings beautifully. And I'd written all these songs in a sort of rock Celtic style, and I put all these keyboard lines and parts on it. And I remember thinking, God, this is a great record. This sounds really good. I really was. But then I suddenly thought to myself, I want to get all the whistles back on it and the flutes because that's how the music was written. All the keyboards were mimicking these instruments. And so I ended up sort of removing probably about 8 or 9 keyboard solos off the record and got those instruments to play the parts that I'd written. So, um, I mean, that was really good fun. It was lovely to hear real violins playing the parts that I'd written. But it was what was really interesting when I was doing those solos. It was really interesting to solo, knowing that you were soloing, trying to solo in the way that that instrument would solo, rather than the way you would solo as a keyboard player. It's trying to solo as a violinist on a keyboard. You're thinking about the how would the fingers actually move on a violin? How would you actually move this around, rather than how do my fingers move on a keyboard playing a violin sound? So that was really interesting. Like doing the whistles and pipe stuff, you had to make sure that the notes that you were playing were the notes that matched what the instruments you would have playing, like an Ilian pipe with a low drone or something. So it was very interesting to do.
Yeah. You've got a tour after this American tour. You've got a tour in England in April. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so after I come back from the tour with Dad, I'm going to go back out with my own band, and we're going to do a few 4 dates we're doing first of all, and it is the From a Page tour. We did a headline festival about a year and a half ago, where we played the tracks from a page on stage, and it went down really well. The show was a sellout. Everybody came up to us after and said, "Oh, you should do that again." And I thought, "Yeah, great, we'll do," and didn't really think anything else about it. And then I got contacted earlier on in the year from a couple of agents about doing some shows in Europe and possibly some shows in the UK. And then before I knew it, 4 venues had come in and said, "Oh, we'd like you to do some shows in April." So we're doing that in April, and then in November we're going back out again around the UK, and then we're going out into I think we're going out to Norway and Germany. And if that all goes well, then hopefully in 27 we'll take the show and play more places and try and expand the tour a little bit. So I'm really looking forward to it because it's going to be a show of 2 halves. The first half will be music from my solo career, and then the second half will be the music that I've worked with Yes on the From a Page record. So it's going to be a good fun show. I'm really looking forward to it. In fact, that's why the records are sat here reminding me of what I've got to learn.
Yeah. I think that's a good spot to end it. Oliver, it's been great talking to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you
Good
ever so
luck on the
much.
tour.
Thank you very much. You get enough? You got everything you need?
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant stuff. All right. Well, let me know when it's out and I can give it a plug on socials.
All right, thank you. See ya.
And when's your next gig? You say it's coming up soon?
February. Yeah,
Oh, well, good luck with that. I hope it goes well.
thank you.
All right then. Cheers then.
Yeah.